far, and we're going to get started. So we're now recording, and so just we'll say a big welcome to this session, which is so you want to build an orchestration or two. So you'll have to forgive the Oliver Twist reference. I have been absolutely dying to have a pun reference for a title in the Salesforce talk for a while, and Orchestrator seemed to fit a good reference. So I'm going to go through the session today, and it's only going to be around 25 minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them into the session chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to them towards the end of the session. I won't be able to see the Q&A and the chat while I'm screen sharing, just with the way things are set up. So all the questions will be picked up on towards the end. But feel free to pop in questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll get to them towards the end. So this is so you want to build an orchestration or two. Just so you know a little bit about myself, I'm not going to go over this way too much because you know me a bit already, hopefully. I've been in the ecosystem since 2016, and I'm a 5-time certified Salesforce professional, 6 if you include the partner credential, which I have in process automation. I'm an all-star Trailhead Ranger, and I'm very active in the Salesforce community. I co-lead the Newcastle upon Tyne user group, and I've spoken at over 15 different events, with most of them actually coming this year, to be honest, including Dreamforce this year. And I'm a mentor through the Super Mums program and also the Trailblazer community. And really, most importantly for this session and this conference, I myself would classify myself as a self-diagnosed flow fanatic. So I absolutely love flow. In fact, I was probably one of the first people, if not even maybe the first person, to do a presentation on Orchestrator in the community. Orchestrator came out at the back end of last year as a beta and is now generally available. And I think, if my memory serves correctly, I would have been one of the first people to do any presentations on Orchestrator. So I've been talking about it all throughout this year, including at Dreamforce, where I spoke on both Slack and Orchestrator and how you can combine them together to create some really powerful guided processes. But what we're going to cover in this session is going to be quite a basic session in terms of kind of thinking about Orchestrator. So we're going to cover what Orchestrator is in a basic level detail. We're going to cover some of the basic building blocks of Orchestrator, including some information on the limits and costs behind using Orchestrator, because Orchestrator is a product essentially that is on a freemium scale, although it is within the Flow Builder framework. It is on a freemium scale. And we're going to talk about stages and steps, because they are the two core components within orchestrations. And we're going to kind of wrap it up with a bit around best practices and principles, and then questions and answers. Before version of a forward-looking statement, which I refer to as a not so forward-looking statement, and this is that this session, we're not going to actually be building any flows in this session. We're going to actually be talking specifically around kind of the strategy, planning, and best practices of using Orchestrator in your orgs. I work for Salesforce, so if you have a question that is specifically one that should be answered by Salesforce, I might not be able to answer that. Who is in this Trailblazer community, who absolutely loves process automation and flow specifically, and I'm very involved in that kind of realm within the community, but I myself do not work for Salesforce, so I might not have all of the answers for you. So I want to give that shout out. I do want to give a quick little mention, and I'll post a link very quickly into the chat for that. Planning on what series as I do going forward next year. In terms of flow content, I'm actually in the middle of a rebrand, which will be kicking off early next year, where most of the stuff I do at the moment, where I blog, will be becoming something that is solely focused on flow. And with that, I'm going to be trying to deliver more sessions around flow. And particularly, I'm going to be looking at stuff around Orchestrator, Slack, and a bunch of other things. So if you are interested in potentially joining in with any of those sessions, I do have a Google form up at the moment where we're asking people to kind of give me some ideas as to what they would like to see. So I'm going to just share that link quickly in the chat and go back to the presentation. So going into what is Flow Orchestrator. So in brief, Orchestrator is a type of flow that can carry out background processes and interact steps with different users and or teams. Really how it's built up is you use decision elements and stages and steps to really kind of build out a really powerful guided process. I'm going to just copy as well and post this into the chat. This is a really helpful article from Salesforce Ben on Flow Orchestrator. So this is something that'd be really, really helpful to go and check out if and when you get the time. The thing I would say about Orchestrator, you can understand it just in terms of how you access it. Flow Orchestrator, it's a bit unusual in terms of access within Flow because it is not listed within as a Flow type when you go in and launch Flow. What you'll see when you go in and launch Flow, you'll see some basic flow types. You'll see your screen flows, record triggered flow, schedule triggered flow, auto launch flow, and platform event triggered flows coming out on that first modal when you click on to create a new flow. Orchestrator is not available in there as of yet. What you'd have to do is you'd have to go into your all plus templates section when you click on a new flow, and you'd have to then go to the Orchestrator section within that, and you'll get two options. You'll get record triggered orchestration, and you'll get an auto launched orchestration, because you can actually connect Orchestrator to things as essentially as a subflow if you build it out well. But that's a little bit more advanced, so that's not something we're going to really dive into today, because we said we aren't going to be doing really anything inside of Flow itself for this session. We're going to be talking about Orchestrator and how you can best use that. So just to cover the limits and the costs of using Orchestrator before we move into kind of talking about the stages and steps, and then the best practices and some tips I have as well. Orchestrator does have some limits. I mentioned that it was on a freemium scale. And at the moment, what we have is you can do what is called the run with an orchestration. Now, this is something that you want to be aware of when it comes to using Orchestrator, because oftentimes when we talk about Orchestrator, one of the misconceptions out there is around what a run is for Orchestrator. And an orchestration run is basically when the flow is fired. So, and when I'm talking about the orchestration being fired. So if you have a record triggered orchestration that does not have an entry criteria, for example, and it launches anytime you open up your page, when you have it on as a work guide in there, it will count as a run. And what it'll have to do as well is that orchestration will be counted as a run even if you don't complete it. So you don't have to go from start to finish for it to be counted as a run. You just have to start it. And this is a bit of a chance to mention, as we can see on the side there, we've got 600 free runs of Orchestrator in production orgs a year. Now that limit does refresh every year. However, you can imagine if you've got, say, an orchestration on, say, an opportunity record, a record that you'll be going back to regularly to do things like change the stage or to add any further information to the description. Maybe you could be making some tweaks to the record. An opportunity is a good example of that, because you'll be making changes to that record a lot. Same as a case. Actually, a case would be a good example of a orchestration where you'd be doing a lot of edits on the record. And I do talk about this a little bit in my tips going forward, but 600 runs a year for orchestration, that can quickly tally up. you could easily do about 100, could be even potentially do like 100 or a couple of hundred runs a day, depending on what entry criteria, if any, you have for that orchestration. Now, I do mention that there was no cap on the runs inside DevOrgs and sandboxes, which is really, really good for testing. But there is a cap in production. After your 600 runs, there is a cost. And although I have to this day not had official confirmation from an account executive what the cost is, the cost I have seen being floated around consistently within the community, which leads me to think it is correct, is $1 per run after your 600 free runs have finished. And my understanding as well is that you can actually buy them in bulk. But on this, what I would say is, just to kind of ensure that we are above board on what we say here, is that any information like this is what I have seen from the community, and this is what I'm aware of, and this is stuff, as I mentioned, is consistently mentioned. So I think will be the case. The recommendation would be, if you feel you're going to need more runs, speak to your account executive, and they will be able to advise you on what you need and be able to help you kind of get all of that sorted out. So again, best principle for that would be, if you're unsure about what the costings are and the potential implications, get in touch with your account executive and open up a conversation about Orchestrator there in terms of getting more runs. Moving into stages and steps, because these are the two core kind of elements within Orchestrator. As I mentioned before, you can use stages and steps and decision elements. A stage is basically what the overarching element that is used to house the steps in. So all of your steps would have to be within a stage. And there are two very specific types of steps that we have within Orchestrator. We have what is called a background step, which is a auto launch flow, or an interactive step, which is a screen flow. And when you see that, you might be wondering, well, why am I mentioning what types of flows they are specifically? Well, this is because how Orchestrator works is you would create essentially a framework for basically firing flows in an order. So each of the background steps or the interactive steps would be its own flow. So you'd have to have all of these flows created and then to bring them into an orchestration in there. You can actually now open those flows inside a flow builder and make changes and save them and so on and so forth. But what you can't do in a orchestration at the moment is create a new flow from that orchestration. So you have to create those flows that you're going to use within an orchestration in advance. Steps as well, talking about steps. Steps or tasks that are assigned to various users, and these are the case for the interactive steps. Background steps will run in the background and don't need to be assigned to anybody in particular, but steps do need to be assigned to at least one user. And steps can be assigned to the following groups. It can be assigned to users, groups, or queues. And for each one, what you've got here is the option to do what is called a resource. So you can have a user resource, a group resource, or a queue resource. How this differs in orchestration is that, for example, a user, what you'll get is you'll go into your Flow Orchestrator, and if you have it set to user, you'll be brought up with essentially a lookup component where you can type in the name of the user and assign it to them. Alternatively, you can use a resource, which basically means you would have to have a variable which is equal to a username rather than a user ID, and link it to the user that way. I prefer using the resource method because we can make it dynamic rather than having to be set to specific users. I have never once used a specific user in an actual use case where I've been using Orchestrator properly. I have used non-resource versions of these when I've been doing demos and tests, but in an actual use case where I've actually built an orchestration for somebody to use, I've never once used anything other than the resource versions. Just a quick note on that, I mentioned before that the user resource has to be a user name rather than a user ID. This isn't the case for groups and queues, though. Group and queue resources are IDs within Orchestrator. So that's a big thing to be aware of, to remember the difference between those two, where, say, the user would be tied to user resource, would be tied to a user name. Group and queue resources are tied to the IDs of the group or the queue. In terms of best practices, which we want to kind of do, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and we will be having about 5 minutes or so for Q&A. I want to go over some best practices and principles. As I said, this is quite a basic kind of introduction to Orchestrator. One of the things I do plan on doing next year is doing kind of like an Orchestrator masterclass for people who are interested in learning more about Orchestrator. And that would probably be about 4 or 5 weeks, I think. But with the best practice and principles, the thing I would say in this, I personally think that Orchestrator is, out of all of the different types of flows that you can build, Orchestrator is the one you have to really think about a lot, because there is a lot of involved in that. As I mentioned, each of these steps are their own flow. So you want to be able to take time to plan and map out the orchestration that you're going to build. So whether that is an orchestration to handle case management, whether it is a orchestration to handle like an opportunity pipeline, essentially, you can use Orchestrator for a lot of different use cases. But what the thing I would say is you want to be taking the time to plan and to map them out. I wouldn't be just going out and using Orchestrator without having thought about it through first. Into going back into that, you want to build. I would not personally build an orchestration if it didn't have multiple steps, and that might be my opinion. But you see, if you were in Cassie's session earlier on, you saw that there was an example of a flow there where it was just one element. If you had a process that was just basically a one would equate to a one element thing, I personally wouldn't bother using that as an orchestration. It would have to have multiple steps in there, and I would only really use it as well if you can pass it across to different people. Now you can have that done dynamically, as I mentioned, but I would be looking at having a minimum of 2 to 3 steps across different users before using an orchestration. And also, finally, in terms of my best practices and principles, just goes back to the way I'm thinking on Orchestrator these days. I think Orchestrator definitely is the one that needs the most documentation because of how it uses other flows, and there was so much involved in actually building an orchestration in terms of who it gets assigned to, what page it gets displayed on, and those kind of things. Documentation for Orchestrator is going to be a massive thing going forward, I think. And that is something I'm working on as well, some templates around that personally as well. So those are kind of my best practices and tips. So again, plan and map out your orchestration that you're looking to build and deploy. Build orchestration are multi-step processes that reach across multiple users in your org, and document orchestrations that you build, making it clear what they will be doing and how they will run in practice. That's kind of what I think are the best practices and principles for Orchestrator right now. But before we go into Q&A, let's bring in some of my tips. So with that, I've mentioned before about using the assignee resources first and foremost. That would be my go-to. So when you go to Orchestrator and you look to who you're going to assign a step to, my recommendation would be to use the resources first and foremost. And that is because you can have them be dynamically assigned using Orchestrator. So you don't have to essentially do a selection of them, because you might have an example. Say for example, you're working in an organization where you have multiple teams across multiple continents that handle cases. You might have a team based out of EMEA. You might have a team based in APAC or EMEA. So you might want to send kind of use an orchestration to basically make sure a case is handled by the EMEA team if it's an EMEA related case. Same with opportunity. So having those assigning resources be assigned dynamically, I think, is a good process. Using flow templates and recycling flows and orchestrations. Yeah, this is something that I'm getting a bit more bigger on, largely because of Orchestrator and also because of the work I've been doing around Slack. I would highly recommend people to use flow templates and to basically build out flows that they can use different multiple times. In an orchestration, you can have the same flow be used multiple times. So if it's a screen flow, you can have the same screen flow in an orchestration 3 or 4 times. It doesn't necessarily matter how many times you have that in. You can have it in different steps as well. So I would be looking at kind of building out flows that you can use again and again in terms of that. And that's something I'll be looking at probably for putting some content around that particular idea in the future as well. Going back to the whole point I was made about runs earlier on, I would recommend using entry criteria to prevent unnecessary runs, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to see a orchestration firing and again count against your runs when you don't need to actually run it, because that will cost you your runs very quickly. Mentioned about here briefly by using a naming convention for your stages and steps. I think this is just a good practice, just so you can be very clear when you go into your document, into your flow. You can see, okay, what's stage 1, what's the step there, because what you can't do is you can't drag steps around at the moment. So if you say it had a step that you created and you go, okay, well, that's actually step 2 in this stage when I created it, but should be step 3 now. You can't drag the order around. You can change the order, but inside of the canvas, you can't drag the order around. So using a naming convention, such as I use for steps, I will use an abbreviation of the stage and the number, and then the step. So, for example, I'd have, like, if it was step 1 in stage 1, I'd have S1, for example, as I've worked with in the past, but that might change in the future. And finally, again, like tips for getting the most out of it, document it. Make it clear what your orchestration is meant to do. Make it clear what each element is and is going to do. Make it clear who the assignee is for which step, and highlight which flows are used in the orchestration. This is probably the most challenging bit, but I am actually working myself on a suite of templates around flows in terms of documentation. So that's not something I've got quite ready yet. But you want to have a means of kind of going and referring to other documentation that you've got. So that might just be as simple as a Google Doc, where you include links to other Google Docs for your flows in within an orchestration one. But those are my tips. Before we move on, we do have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to hop over to my other tab to see if there's any questions and pick up on them. Yes, so in terms of the links for the last 2 pages, I'll put those in there. These are links to my blog. So I've got one on Flow templates, and let me just go back. And I've got one on documenting flows. So there is those links. I'm going to check the Q&A. So Joey's asked, do we have any insights on adoption of Orchestrator in terms of how many companies really find a lot of value from it? I can imagine for certain use cases, businesses can justify it. Yeah, this is one of those ones where it's quite difficult to answer because I have not seen any official statistics. I personally don't know of too many organizations who have fully adopted it, and a lot of that is down to the freemium scale. There is some bigger businesses that I have heard of that are using it, but in terms of an overall kind of statistic, I don't have any major insights in terms of adoption. Most of the people I've talked to in the community have shown stuff around Orchestrator, have really liked it, but I've been very hesitant to dive into it because of that 600 per run issue. So hopefully that kind of answers that a little bit. And Pavel asked for what kind of real life examples of using Orchestrator have you seen? So I've mentioned before there, I've seen examples of it being used for around case management. So if a case status has changed, they want the input. So those kind of ones have been used. Handling and managing opportunities that come in, I've seen that being used as well. One that I have built as a good use case fairly recently was actually a guided process to basically handling and managing Slack. Creation of channels, sending messages, and those kind of things. I've actually demoed a use case of using Orchestrator to basically handle the process of basically managing a Slack channel when it is connected to Salesforce. Joey's also mentioned, yeah, the way, yeah, the freemium model is a bit of an issue. Personally, I'm hoping that will change at some point, but we'll see what happens. And yeah, exactly. Yeah, so Joyce mentioned the Q&A that 600 could equate to about 50 per month, and $1 per run that could be expensive for certain orgs, and peanuts for big, large orgs. Yeah, exactly. $100 per run is not going to be a big dent if you're like a multi-million-dollar company, but if you're a small non-profit, for example, $1 per run would potentially have a massive impact. So I'm just going to check if there's any more questions in the queue in the chat, and I think that's it. So I want to say a big thank you to everybody. We'll wrap that up here, and I want to say a big, huge thank you, and hope everybody has a good break for lunch. We will be back at a 1 p.m. isn't it? Yes, we'll be back at 1 p.m. With a session around MuleSoft with Gaurav. So please do come back at 1 p.m. So that is in an hour and 20 minutes, and we'll see you then. Thank you.